I was reading, as I periodically do, I was reading something that Swami Sri Yukteswar said in the Holy Science, and he lists in there something that we take introductory classes and we learn about what he called the meannesses of the heart. And he said it was these meannesses of the heart that tend to keep us from being able to make significant progress on the spiritual path. Because really, we must understand it is opening up, magnetizing the heart that is the first requisite to deep progress on this path of yoga, to spiritual enlightenment, to spiritual attainment. It's the blockages of the heart that are of, you might say, strongest uh, barriers that we have to overcome. Some people might think, well, it's misunderstanding, intellectual. No, no, no. It's not a matter of gathering more information or even becoming a little bit wiser in the intellectual sense. It's really about becoming wiser in the sense of the heart. The heart's feelings are what need to be awakened. Yes, they do, but they have to be pointed, those feelings, which tend to naturally go out and express themselves outwardly through the ego, through our attachments, through our prejudices, our likes and dislikes, which is the natural way we live in this world. Those have to be, you could say, not cut off. I'm not going to say it that way. Oh, I'm just going to stop feeling, because that's obviously not something that we can do, nor do we want to do, because it's that feeling nature that is really, that needs to be purified. And so we have to take that feeling nature and, you might say, redirect it in the right direction. And when we talk about emotions, we talk about negative emotions, because they're positive emotions too. Joyful elation when your side wins the game, and or something goes well, you get very elated. Are those bad as well? Well, they're not necessarily bad. They feel very good, but the degree that our life is lived on that roller coaster of up and down, eventually we're going to find that it's limiting, and we're not going to be able to accomplish what we really want to do, was to go beyond the superficial likes and dislikes. And so Swami Sri Yukteswar, as I said, he listed in his uh, treatise on the Holy Science, he lists that there are meanness, you might say, these essential meannesses of the heart. Now, when he said meanness of the heart, the word mean has different meanings in the English language. In one way, of course, we think mean is somebody's cruel. A mean, he's a meanness. And so the mean elements, the cruel elements of the heart, those sorts of things, we can think of it in that way. And I suppose this does apply. But meanness also means small. He's a man of very little means, or abilities, you might say. Or he's mean in his expression. It means small or limiting also. Now he lists 8 of them, and they were hatred, shame, fear, grief, condemnation, race prejudice, pride of pedigree, and a narrow sense of respectability. Now we could give a class series on each of those too someday. Maybe we will. But basically, why did he call these meannesses? Or let's take it in terms of mean, meaning making small. People who adopt those approaches to life, and most of them, as you will see, are reactive. Hatred. I hate something because it's an emotional reaction toward being dissatisfied. Something has not pleased me, or some person has not pleased me, and I or perhaps taken something from me, or broken my attachment to something without my will. These things, these meannesses make us small. They contract our sense of self, of who we are. And you could say that they're negative in the sense that our life force goes down. And when we say down, we mean it goes down into body consciousness. It goes down into ego consciousness. Ego is the soul attached to this limitation of the body. This is me, this personality is me. As opposed to our real divine self as a child of God, and we're expansive. And so those things that take us into a higher understanding of who and what we are. Those things are said to be positive in the spiritual sense because they expand us. And when, as we've said many times, when you expand something, you have a sense of joyfulness, a sense of inner happiness. When you have the contraction, you end up feeling all of the negative sides of these emotions that go with it because they're rooted in downward motion of life force identifying with the ego. And so if you look at these, and one of them is what I wanted to start off speaking with, is this one about grief. Now, overcoming these, before I lose this train of thought, the overcoming of these, they're in looking at how do we overcome these meannesses of the heart, these negative emotional reactions to life. And Swami Kriyananda explains, he goes on, he says, it's by developing magnanimity of the heart. In other words, a magnanimous attitude, an expansive attitude, an all-encompassing attitude of other people, our oneness with other people, an outward flowing of becoming larger, which is, by its very nature, an upward movement. So if we think in terms of magnanimity, for whatever the emotion that we feel, that gives us a key about how we might be able to overcome some of these negative emotions. And to sum that up, which we're going to do a little bit more of next week as we come to a summary, but summing it up very specifically here is to expand your heart's love for others. Because the ego, when we tend to think about the ego, and let's start with this one I just mentioned about grief, which Sri Yukteswar lists as a meanness of the heart. Grief is absorbing in the little way. It's self-absorbing. Grief, to be grieving. We're thinking, essentially, we think we're grieving for a loss, perhaps a loved one is lost, and we think we're grieving for that person, but really we're grieving for the sense of loss that we feel, that we experience when somebody passes. Now, I don't mean to minimize this, because this is a very natural thing that we all, to some degree, I think we all feel. And if we don't feel grief, oh, I'm above it all, that's cold. Look at Master's own life. He felt tremendous grief, and it's a major theme in the early part of his life when his mother died. His mother passed, and he said it affected him for many years, that to be able to overcome that grief. And you see in many people's lives, you feel that grief, and I look back, I've lost loved ones, and I can recall there's that element of grief. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't be aware of these negative emotions. They come into us, they pass through us. And I think to some degree, all of us, just like the great masters demonstrated in their life, you look at Master's life, and he chose to live on it. They come in, avatars do into this human body, and they experience life through that human body, and they are very aware of all of the human emotions. Would we have any sense of attraction to them if they were not? I mean, you could say if they had no feeling, they would be somewhat. The idea would be, how can they possibly relate to my dilemma? But if we see somebody like Master who grieved tremendously, but yet transcended it, it bonds us to him. And we see, yes, I can understand that. And he had to go through that grief, and through that grief he came out and processed that, and you could sort of, the empathy grows with that. And we see in our own struggles with grief that when we're able to overcome such an emotion, or to not overcome in the sense that we forget it, but to be able to transcend and go beyond it, we begin to see that one of the elements that comes in transcending emotions such as that is the growth of empathy, sympathy for other people. They too, I'm grieving tremendously, but so is everybody. Everybody loses loved ones in this life. And all of us, we begin to see the natural rhythm of life. And I feel there's a sense of bonding, of common humanity when we experience grief for ourselves. We experience all of these emotions for ourselves and see that everybody has experienced these emotions for themselves. Yet, for the true person of spiritual success, we are able to transcend that. And we see the saints and sages do that in their lives. It gives us encouragement and it gives us hope. But you find that to hang on to that grief and to make it, you might say, somewhat of a self-identity of your grieving for that past loved one, there's a self-absorption that comes with it. It's unhealthy. And you can see, and perhaps we know people like this, I certainly do, that are living in that grief and hanging on to it for whatever the reason is. But it's an unhealthy reason to be able to hang on to that and transcend it and use that grief in order to go beyond it. So we can't deny our grief. Certainly we can't suppress it. It's something natural, but in time we transcend it and we go on. And one of the ways I've noticed that for most, and I think you would agree, that when you have a time of grief, there's an appropriate amount of time. You have to be appropriate to the situation, and you feel, and you remember the positive things. And I've noticed this. So I attended a astral ascension service a few weeks ago for a friend who, of decades, who'd passed. He had passed on, and people like to get up and share. And they shared very short, maybe 30 seconds, a minute worth of remembrance, and bringing out the positive. Remembering that person in a positive vein and holding on to that positive memory. And it's not holding on to the sense of loss, but it's holding on and wishing the well-being of that soul as they continue their spiritual endeavor. And so this is the positive way to remember and to learn from whenever we in life suffer, whether it be grief or loss of loved ones or in lack of success. We learn something, and you might say, sadder but wiser, as the saying goes, but certainly we hope we're a little bit more, our heart is expanded to encompass sympathy for other people. And I've noticed that when something unpleasant like that happens in my life, I like to keep busy. Action and engagement in positive things rather than self-absorption in my loss. I feel that loss, but yet I know that would the person who passed, would they want me to suffer? No, they would not want me to suffer. They'd want me to go on. And so we take what we can and we channel that love, you might say, in our prayers to them, but they channel that love also to putting in action what that person who had passed would really want for us, if that person truly did love us. Now, one of the elements of grief is it's part. You might say grief is an aspect of a larger subset of emotions that we feel, and you might say under the heading of sadness. People feel sad, a sense of sadness, a sense of which, if magnetized, unfortunately, can become debilitating. It can be habitual sadness or malaise, continual discouragement, and even taken to the point people feel depressed. They can't get out of it. And it colors, and this is the warning, you might say, or the lesson we learn when we feel something like grief, is we grieve, and even society itself many cultures set time limits. You're going to wear perhaps black. In some cultures, you wear black for a year. After 1 year, you put it aside, and because society knows that we have to move on and grow, take the lessons that grief induced in us, and then perhaps put it outwardly in a positive way. Well, sadness itself, we may be able to do that outwardly, but that sadness that some people approach life, they take an attitude of that. This is an emotional reaction to life. And when we're emotionally reactive, and it can become habitual. And I think many of the nefarious things about these negative emotions is that we make a habit of them and we begin to adopt an attitude toward life that is pessimistic, perhaps. Oh, cynical, perhaps. Maybe I'm just fooling myself. Discouragement. And what does that do when you take that approach to life? You saps your energy and it saps your joy. And this is why Paramhansa Yogananda made such a emphasis on the adoption of a positive attitude. Now, and why we practice affirmation in whatever form that might take. And some people might complain, well, I don't really feel that way. I'm being false if I affirm. I'm really sad, but if I emphasize positiveness, I'm not positive. No, that's not the right way to look at it because you're assuming that your reality is discouragement, and that's not you either. So consequently, sometimes you have to take, as the yogis sometimes say, you have to take, if you have a splinter, you take another splinter to work that splinter out, and then you throw both of them away. And so, yes, if you don't want to be a jolly good fellow, we don't want to assume that that's who we are either. But nevertheless, to see the positive or the potential toward the light in everything that we do is, you can say, well, it's not real. I don't feel that way. But yet, it's more real than to think of yourself as the negative and inclined toward darkness, because darkness is not the ultimate reality. Light, joy, bliss is the ultimate reality. This life, this creation descended from that. And our goal is to ascend to that. And although you may not feel it in the moment, you're affirming a truth. Whereas negativity, sadness, malaise, pessimism, cynicism, sarcasm, they do not affirm a reality. And there is a basic difference. It's not like, well, one's as good as the other. No, it's not. Now, just from a practical sense, it's not as good as because you just don't feel good when you're in the dark side. It doesn't lead to what you really want, and it leads to you might see temporal results. Whereas on the positive side, it leads to lasting results. And I think everybody, unless you're very much darkened in your habits, would agree that light, it's much better to feel joy than it is sadness. And so, but in order, that is an act of will. Now, I mentioned this in a different class setting, but many people said, well, I don't want to love, because I don't feel love. And I feel false when I'm affirming loving somebody, and I don't really love them. And I want to love only when I feel like it. That's a wrong understanding. Love takes a great deal of self-effort to really love, because what are you doing when you love? You're raising your life force, you're raising your consciousness to be able to receive and to express love. And you're not creating the love, but it takes effort to open the door. Let's substitute for love, let's say positivity. Positive vibrations in life, it takes effort. And the normal way is to try to change something external to ourselves, make a better, make a better tasting dinner and I'll feel happy. Well, that's not bad, but can you always guarantee that? If we can learn to uplift, open the door, we find that even a very mediocre dinner will taste good. And you find that this is the answer to when a person is in a state of habitual sadness or malaise or depression. Now, unfortunately, you can't tell somebody this. They have to you can tell them, but for them to truly take this in for themselves, they have to be encouraged to do it themselves. And this is why environment comes in. Environment being stronger than willpower. Many people don't have the ability to raise their own energy, but if they can just remember this one solution. If we are sad, we're in malaise, we find it's more than just a temporary passing thing, it's become a habit, is if we are wise enough to choose our environment to put us in the direction that we want to aspire toward. That we'll find it'll take us in the right direction, because sooner or later we have to go in that direction, and we don't want to be forced. We want to make these from our own free choice rather than having circumstances force us. Because sooner or later, if you remain in a state of sadness, of negative emotion, circumstances will complement that, and you'll end up being forced, and it can be painful. And who wants that? We don't want that. So we have to make this effort on our by our own will. And if we form the habits, the positive habits of being positive in the face of adversity. If you look at, you could say, all of these emotions that we've been speaking about, they're all related in some degree to attachment. Grief, sadness, depression. Something has been taken from us to which we've been attached. We want that person to still be in our life, but it's not possible, perhaps. And it's life itself forcing us to adapt, to be able to accommodate to that change, because we come to understand that we are not in charge of this world. There's something larger, and we have to come to that, and if we can come to an understanding of being less attached to the way things are, or perhaps less attached to the way that we want things to be, there's going to be a less of a tendency to react, to help us to overcome the reactive tendency in life, which is another way of saying yoga. We begin to learn yoga. There's a story that I remember from years ago, that there was a disciple of a guru. He was a boy. He was a boy, and the guru was a very stern taskmaster of a guru. And every little fault, the boy, maybe like a Sri Yukteswar magnified, he would catch him at it. But every afternoon, one of the young boys, the chela's, the disciple's duty was to make tea for the master. And so he would serve this tea in a very beautiful teacup that was a favorite. The master, the guru, loved this teacup because it was so beautiful, precious. And so he would make the tea, the disciple would, every afternoon. He'd make it. One afternoon, the boy was careless, and he dropped the teacup, and he broke it. And so he went out. He knew he couldn't hide this, and he had to find a solution. So he went out and engaged the master, who was giving a discourse about life and death and this world. And he said, he asked the master, he says, why do people die? Why is there death? And the master says, well, son, everything passes. All life is transient. Everything that is existence must someday go. And all of us must learn to be able to accept and not to grieve for these things. A little bit of grief for the momentary passing, yes, but we can't hold on. We have to let it go, learn our lesson, and accept that God is in charge of this life. And so the boy says, yes, master, I understand. I would like to report to you today, I'm very sorry, but your teacup has died. And of course, what was the master going to say to that? And anyway, but very clever young soul. And but I think one of the things, if we find, which sometimes people remain in this, you might say, state of malaise or sadness, one of the things I think is you can counsel people, and it's very difficult to counsel people out of it. But I have found in moments where perhaps I've been in a negative mood for a time, if we can learn to translate sadness into determination towards some chore that we have or something that we have, we put all of our energy into something positive. And I like to usually you have a project of some sort, something outward, takes you away from self-involvement, which was what sadness is. We're involved in our own uncomfortable situation. To be able to find a project, and if you can help other people, engaging them in some way into activity to be able to take the mind away from its, you might say, its tendency to go within oneself. And this is why it's very important, get a person active, be active yourself. And for ourselves, we have to prepare ourselves ahead of time. Even-mindedness, even in when little things come and when little things go, to be even-minded in those things. Then when big things go. I remember years ago, I had a motorcycle. I loved my motorcycle. It was so much fun. And one day it was stolen. And I realized it was stolen. And I remember the process of my heart being, something was being savored, oh, my motorcycle's gone. And but I thought, look, this is a good test. And it took me about 10 minutes, I think, to be able to accept it. But this is what we should do at night. Those things we're attached to. Be like Master, who he saw when he had a motorcycle as a young man. He saw somebody admiring it, and he went out and said, "Do you like it?" And the young man said, "Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. I wish I only had something like as nice as this." He says, "Oh, you want it? Oh, what do you mean?" He says, "Here." And Master gave him the keys to the motorcycle. Huh. He let it go right then. Yeah, maybe why did he do that? I don't know. But it was maybe he was just testing himself or demonstrating something. Or maybe the motorcycle had served its purpose and he no longer was needed. And you could see that, those things are what we might do at night to be able to release ourselves from that attachment, which is at the nature of grief, the sense that life has failed us. Oh, yeah, life hasn't failed us. You could say if we persist in that attitude of grief, we are failing life. And so we don't want to be that way. I think, too, you could say that grief knits people together. And I think when a person is grieving, it's time they need support. If we have a friend who's in grief, it's time to give that person, that's a good time to be there for them. Not to tell them philosophy, don't philosophizing, but just be there for other people as a friend. And I think you find that commonality with other people. When we're grieving, the heart reaches out to others because we intuitively know that the heart needs to not focus on itself, but to reach out and embrace something larger. So I think we seek out the bonds of other people. And so our job is, for counseling other people, is to fulfill that need of the other person, to reach out to others, to be there, to give them support. And we find even in ourselves, if processing grief in a proper way is done, we find a deeper sense of self-purpose. What would that person who has passed in our life, what would they really want from me? I think of my brother passed a few years ago, and I was sad for that. You might say missing something. But then I think, what did he want for me? And he wanted the best for me. What would I do to make him happy? What could I do to make him happy? And if we think that way, you see our natural expansiveness comes out. One thing that is though, all of these negative emotions of sadness, particularly, of whether it manifests as grief or depression or despair, unfulfilled aspirations, all of these, is that there is you might say a temptation to give up hope. And that's a very dangerous thing, because hope is the antidote for despair. Hope is the antidote of grief. And we want to hope for a better future, better situation, better whatever it might be. And it's very important. Hope that we might be successful. We get discouraged on the spiritual path. Oh, I'm never going to make any progress. I'm always going to be stuck. I keep failing. Hope, you could say, is that light in the midst of darkness that calls us forward. And if that light is allowed to go out, we really can't make forward progress in life. And so hope is something never to destroy in another person. And we can do that in little ways without even knowing it. If other person, they lose hope, we have to actually do the opposite, to positively be able to encourage people to, if not overtly, covertly at least, to be able to give people hope in the future. In other words, this is another way, if we're applying this to ourselves, is to keep a positive attitude. I may feel bad today, but I know and I hope, and that hope's based upon past experience, that there's going to be better things in the future, and there will be. If we fall into cynicism or resignation in the face of which is very easy to do in the face of difficulties, we certainly don't want to foster that in others. But I think we have to give that hope to, not to be cynical, even in our humor or whatever it is. It's a dangerous thing to play with those attitudes of or resign to the fact that I'm always going to be a loser. The problem with hope, though, and people sometimes are afraid to hope because or you could say it courts the risk of disappointment. My hopes were dashed. Oh, I'm never going to love again. My hopes are dashed. And of course, that's not true, but that's the risk. And some people, they're afraid to hope for a better future for themselves or for others because they have been disappointed in the past. And so I think coming to terms with disappointment, grief, are something that the truly spiritual person learns to deal with. That our hope has been misplaced. Usually our hope is placed in things outwardly, turning out a certain way. And with time we learn not to be hopeless, but to place our hope in inward directions. That God doesn't disappoint us ever. God tests us, yes, but God doesn't disappoint us. And God is there for us. And God, you could say these tests and trials that we go through life are there is His way, God's way of testing us and making us stronger so that next time we will succeed. But it can be nurtured by the individual, yes, but it can be nurtured by friends, family, and other people. And I think this is for us as devotees, when we're in times of difficulty in meditation, and you're perhaps in times of grief or disappointment, sadness, concentrate and try to feel in the heart. Now, this has to be, you have to understand, you can't dwell on the negative feeling in the heart. I'm not saying that at all. There has to be a certain amount of dispassion, you might say depersonalization, so that you're not being swung by the immediate emotion. But when you get to this, calmness is the first requisite. Okay, get very calm, and our teachings apply that. And then to concentrate on the heart and feel in the heart at that point in the heart. And place even place your hand there when you're meditating, just to feel, there, feel the heart and notice the feeling and imagine a feeling of warmth, a sense of caring, a sense of empathy, a sense of that you're protected, God is protecting you, closeness, whatever it is that will stimulate that positive feeling of comfort. And then reflect on that. And you want to be happy, you want to be free. And then silently, he says, may God, or if you want to pray for another person, may this person be happy, may you be happy, and may you be healthy, may you be filled with inner peace. But also for yourself, God, may I pray for thy presence, may I be happy, may I be filled with inner peace, and try to feel that warmth of the heart being lifted upward, up to the point between the eyebrows. And this feeling, in this way, you can stimulate and engender a feeling of compassion for other people. And I'd like to conclude today with a quote from the Dalai Lama. And he says this concern for others is something very precious. We humans have a special brain, but this brain causes a lot of suffering because it is always thinking Me, me, me. The more time you spend thinking about yourself, the more suffering you will experience. The incredible thing is that when we think of alleviating other people's suffering, our own suffering is reduced. This is the true secret of happiness. So this is a very practical thing to do. It is common sense. And this is exactly what we need to find ways, is to redirect that feelings when we're in a negative emotion, we're feeling a negative mood, and it could be even, think about the ones we've talked about already, fear and anger and dislike. They tend to be very self-absorbing, and we're really what somebody is upset, and it's the me. And so now you can't just philosophize your way out of this, and that's what we're going to go into a little bit more next week. But we can, if we realize that the answer lies in not in me, but the answer lies in me getting that attention, that caring, that feeling out toward other people, altruistically, if it in whatever way it is, or serviceful, or whatever it is, and being able to redirect that life force, which is going downward within ourselves into others. By its very nature, it'll be upward. And we'll find that in that we can begin to find the solutions that we're seeking. And so I would like to encourage you to think of questions now. We got one more week, and next week I want to come back and I want to be very practical and try to address these things in terms of practical application. Now, obviously, I hope we get a lot of questions, but if we do get a lot of questions, we'll have to keep them short, the answers short. And like I just saw one pop up here, can grief affect the human heart physically? And yes, the answer is it can. And, well, is it in DNA? Well, now that's a very interesting question, which I'm not going to go into that today, because it possibly could be if we're predisposed in certain biological ways towards something. But that which can be done, I think this is a basic principle of life. That which can be done can be undone. And that's getting into a topic of epigenetics and so on, which I'll reserve for another time. But yes, we have to, anything we do repeatedly can become ingrained within us. And when it becomes, an attitude becomes ingrained within us, it does have a physical effect. This has been demonstrated again and again and again. But again, anything done, we can undo it. We can undo it, no matter how difficult, or at least we can put ourselves in the direction of curing the effects of what has been done in the past. The past, of course, is past. We can't recreate the past, but we can perhaps look for solutions and redirect what affected the past into a new and positive direction. So let's come back next week and on Monday, and we will then look into what are the lessons here, and then how can we apply those lessons in practical ways into our own life. So much joy to you, and God bless all of you. And I'm very happy to be here on this side of the ocean for the next some weeks anyway. Joy to all of you.